decade ago, I was doing a lot of Adobe Flash development, and I had a client in Southern California that was a merchandiser, and they wanted to have a animation for their website as a Flash animation that showed a grid of 16 squares, 4x4 layout, and every second and a half wanted to show their logo, 2 photos of their work, and then a random colored square, and that changed every second and a half and never repeated the same squares from the previous round. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to do that in .NET MAUI. So that's our project for today. I'm calling this fictional company 4 Squared Recreation, and I'm going to provide you 19 images of recreation activities as sort of icons, their logo, and then also a transparent PNG that we use to clear the images that were shown from the previous animation. So that's our project. Here are the product images and the logo that I provide for you in the Canvas site. And my recommendation is use a queue to keep track of the current 4 squares, and then you can add 4 new squares to that queue for the new layout, and take one of those for the logo, 2 for the images, and 1 for the colored square, and then pop the original 4 off, so you have 4 remaining that each time you can go through that process. I just think a queue works really well for that, and you can try a different approach if you prefer. I'll use the random number generator to randomly choose 4 squares out of those 16, and also use the random number generator to create our random color with the red value, green value, and blue value, and then use color.fromRGB. I'll also use a list that contains all the strings, the file names of those images. So those are some tips of how to get started. I recommend you try this on your own. This is a little more challenging project, so feel free to come back and look at my solution. I'm going to do this both in XAML and a C# content page. So I'll do it both ways, and I'll show you an advantage to the C# content page if you want this to be used both on a phone and a tablet. But before I leave you, let me show you the project running in the emulators. So I've got it running here both in a Samsung Galaxy S20 phone emulator and a Samsung Galaxy Tab 7 tablet. You can see it fits both nicely. Now this is the C# UI. As I'll show you later, the XAML code doesn't work well on a tablet when designed for a phone unless you use the on-platform or on-idiom expressions to make some modifications. I didn't do that, and I'll show you the result of that and show you how I think it sometimes is easier mathematically to do it with C# UI. So go ahead and pause here and try this on your own, and come back and watch my code review if you need to. I'm in Visual Studio 2022 on the Windows side, and I'm going to show you the XAML solution first, and then we'll look at the C# UI content page solution. So on XAML, for the content page, I set the nav bar is visible to false, give it a background color of black, and then use the scroll view with a vertical stack layout, kind of our normal process, spacing at 25, padding 30 left and right, vertical start, horizontal center. I created a label. This is going to be our title. Named it 4 Squared. Text color is white. Used font family, font attributes, gave a little bit of padding at the top, centered it. Now here's my grid. So the grid, I set the width request to 340 and the height request the same. I want this to be square. And then I'm setting 4 rows and 4 columns, each of equal height and width. Added to those columns and rows, my 16 image buttons. IB square 1 through IB square 16. They each have a background of black, border color of white. This can give us a nice little grid throughout this, and a border width of 2. That's basically my stack layout. So it's very simple. You're going to see that in the C# UI, I did add a button to pause and resume the animation. You can do that here if you like. It'd basically be the same as what you would have in the C# side. Let's take a look at the C# code behind for that XAML page. I created a random number generator. I also have 2 ints, last image 1 and last image 2. I want to keep track of where those images were last located, those product images. I created a queue called occupied squares, and I initially just chose to set it to 4, 13, 6, and 9. So our first time through, those squares will not be used. You can use any squares you like. You can use 1 through 4, whatever. I created a list of strings called image file. It's going to have all of our file names that I added in to our images resource folder. So I did that before I wrote the code. And then I'm used an iDispatcher timer to control my animation. So here's my main page. After initialize components, I'm going to create a temporary array of type string of all those file names. And then through a loop, I'm going to populate my image file list. I'm going to call a method called random placement. We'll look at that in a minute. And then I set my timer of create a new timer for dispatcher. Set an interval from milliseconds to 1500. That's a second and a half. And then setting the tick event using a lambda expression to random placement. So we use the random placement initially, and then we'll use it every second and a half, and then I start my timer. So here's that random placement. I want to place a logo in 2 squares plus a color square randomly. So I'm going to push or enqueue onto that queue that we had 4 random integers that are not currently in that queue. I'm going to create integers for new square, old square, image 1, and image 2. So integer variables. I'm going to create an array of type integer called new indices. It's going to hold 4 values. And then through a loop, I'm going to go 4 times through the loop from 0 to 3, and I'm going to generate a new square, which is an integer, of the rnd.next 16. That's the value between 0 and 15. I'm going to add 1 to it because I named my squares IB square 1 through IB square 16. While the occupied squares contains that new square, so my queue, which is the occupied squares, if it's already got that number in it, I'm going to regenerate it. So I'm going to get 4 unique numbers. Each time I successfully generate a number, then I'm going to add it to my occupied squares. So the 6th, 7th, and 8th numbers won't duplicate any of the previous ones. I'm going to set the new indices IDX to new square. And that's my array up here, those 4 values. We're going to use those then to set our logo, 2 product images, and our random colored square. So I want to remove the old squares. So I'm just going to go through a loop, and I'm going to go through each one of those first 4 squares from the previous animation. I'm going to get the number from the occupied squares. I'm going to create a target string of LBL square and that number. And then I'm going to use find by name to locate that image button, make that my old target, and then set the source of that to transparent.png. They'll remove any images that are there. I'm going to set the background of the old target to black. That gets rid of the colored square. I'm going to create another string called logo target square, LBL square, and I'm going to take the first index of that new indices array, convert that to a string. I'm creating an image button of logo target with that string using find by name, and I'm going to set its source to the logo.jpg. That's the first of our 4 new squares. Then I'm going to randomly choose 2 new product images out of those 19 that we have over here. I'll use RND to do that. So I'm going to generate image 1, image 2, and I'm going to do that as long as they don't match last image 1 and last image 2, and they don't match each other. So I want 2 unique squares that were not previously used in the previous animation. And I'm going to set last image 1 to image 1 and last image 2 to image 2. Those are my 2 new images. We'll create another string of IB square and that new indice element 1. I'm going to find that image button using find by name and set its source to the image file element image 1. Remember that image file is all of our file names for the graphics. Then we do the same thing for image target 2 string, creating that name using find by name to find the image button and set its source to the image 2 indice of image files. And you take that 4th image button and set its color to a random color. And so I'm going to use RND again to generate a number for my red, green, and blue values between 0 and 255. Create a color called hue. Use the from RGB method and pass it red value, green value, blue value. I'm going to find that new target square. So I'm going to create a string again, a color target string, IB square plus the new indices element 3 to convert it to a string. I'm going to use find by name to locate that image button. And I'm going to set the background color to the new hue that we just generated. And then I added a wait task in here just to make sure the screen was refreshing. So a wait task.delay of 10 milliseconds. And of course we need to make sure then that our method is asynchronous. That's the project. Let me run my code. Again, I'm going to use the Samsung S20. And there is my animation running every second and a half, relocating the logo, 2 new product images, and a randomly colored square. Now let me also demonstrate this on a tablet, and you'll see a problem with the way this is currently done in XAML. I'll use the tab 7. Well, you see the problem is that we set our width to 340 units, but the tablet here is actually 860 units. So it's only displaying on the left-hand side. We can fix that though, of course, using the on idiom. So I'm going to go back to my code and change the width and height request. I changed the width and height request using on idiom. So the grid now is 800 units wide and high on the tablet, and I kept it at 340 on the phone. You can see it looks great on the Samsung S20 and the Samsung S7 tablet. However, just be aware that not every tablet and every phone is the same resolution and the same width. It may not look that good on a few other devices. So I think on the C#, I'm going to show you how you can do this mathematically to basically fit every device. For the C# UI solution, I added a C# UI class as a content page in C#. Nothing really different here. I used the same variables and the queue and the list that I used on the XAML side. In my constructor, we create the temp string array for all the file names and then populate the image file list. Here's what I do differently. I used that very first project that we did in the course to find the width, the height, and the density and figure out how many units wide and high. And we're going to use those values in changing the sizes of things for our UI. So then I have my object factory. The first one is the title. Nothing different here other than look at the font size. I set it to the units wide divided by 15. I played around with the numbers a little bit to figure out what kind of looked good. Everything else is the same. And then for my grid, did the same thing. I set it equal to the units wide, and I wanted to do 90%, so I did it times 0.9, got the integer value of that. Did the same thing, I want the height to be the same, so it's going to be square, so I use units wide rather than units high. Set the column spacing and the row spacing, each equal to 1. Set the background color to white. This is going to give me a nice little grid in between those. I used a nested loop to go through the rows and the columns and add the row definitions for each of the columns and the rows. And I set the width of those equal to my grid.width request divided by 4. So they're each evenly divided into 4s. My animate button, I also used the width request divided by 25 for the font size and divided by 2 and divided by 8 for the width request and height request. So everything will fit every device basically the same based on its width and height. Same with the margin. I used mygrid.width request divided by 15 to give a little margin basically at the top and bottom. Set the BTN animate clicked event using a lambda expression to control animation. So then I'm going to assemble this. So I set the background color of my page to black. We've got a vertical stack layout, spacing of 15. We're going to have vertical options of start, horizontal options center. My children are going to be the title, my grid, and BTN animate. And then again, I'm going to use a nested loop for rows and columns to add the image buttons. And each time through, I create an image button, set its style ID to IB square and whatever the number is. So I have a counter called IB number that is outside of the loop that's getting updated in the loop. So I increment that. And I set the background color to black. I set the border color to white, and the border width equals 2. Set the aspect fit. I'm adding the img button, image button to the grid for each column and row. I'm going to call random placement and set up my timer just as we did before in the XAML. I created a find image button by style ID method as we've looked at before, and finding all the image buttons, putting them in a list, and then just iterating through the loop to find the image button that I'm looking for by its object name. If it finds it, it returns it, otherwise it returns null. So here's the random placement. It's what we did previously in the main page XAML.cs. The only really difference here is when I'm looking for the old buttons, I'm using Find Image Button by Style rather than Find by Name. And I'm doing that in several places. The control animation is my button that lets me pause and resume the animation. So I'm just simply toggling it between pause and resume and turning the time, stopping the timer and restarting the timer, and changing the background color of the button. Then we need to go to the app.xaml.cs and make sure we set the main page equal to use the new C# UI file, and then we can test it. So I'm going to test it here on the tab 7 tablet. And it looks great there. Let me also test it on the phone. And it looks good on the phone as well. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the .NET MAUI Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create, you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.